the affair of the sausages, the martyr's mirror, a little bit of Dutch Baroque art analysis, and more, all coming up in today's Menno Moment.
De weken voor Pasen zijn een periode van bezinning en inkeer. In deze 40 dagen tijd, ook wel lijdenstijd of vastentijd genoemd, leven christenen toe naar het paasfeest. De docenten van het doopsgezind seminarium geven ieder vanuit hun eigen vakgebied een korte reflectie over deze periode, in aanloop naar Pasen. Vandaag Nina Schreuder, kunsthistorica en onderzoeker op het gebied van de doopsgezinde geschiedenis aan het doopsgezind seminarium.
Wat betekent de 40-dagen-tijd voor ons als doopsgezinden? Historisch gesproken is dit zeker niet een van huis uit doopsgezinde traditie. Vroege dopers liepen juist bewust weg van veel kerkelijke tradities, rituelen en liturgische elementen. Ondertussen zitten we hier weer als dopers van de 21ste eeuw. Veel onder ons nemen wel deel aan de 40-dagen-tijd door zelfreflectie, vasten op een of andere manier en andere geestelijke praktijken. We zitten nu juist samen in een Menno Moment, speciaal over de 40-dagen-tijd. Hoe is dit allemaal gelopen? Hoe zit het met het verlaten en met het bouwen van tradities? Hoe zit het met het bewaren van eigen theologische perspectieven en met opnieuw lenen van wat mooi is uit andere kerkelijke tradities? Ik wil met jullie daarover nadenken in het kader van doopsgezinde geschiedenis en kunstgeschiedenis. Ik deel ook een paar verhalen uit mijn eigen ervaring met de 40-dagen-tijd, met voorbeelden van de doopsgezinden in Canada en Nederland. In 1522, Ulrich Zwingli attended a supper at the house of Christoph Froschauer, where those present ate meat during Lent, thus breaking the traditional fast. He preached on the subject, arguing that the fast should not be obligatory, but voluntary. This particular controversial sausage supper, which is now known as the affair of the sausages, was a break from the existing Christian status quo and a catalyst for the Reformation in Zurich. Reforming impulses there took up characteristics of anti-clericalism, and those involved in the movement objected to many aspects of church tradition pertaining to sacraments and liturgy. A few years later, a group broke from among Zwingli's followers and they conducted adult baptisms. This is a moment often recognized as a starting point of Anabaptism in the Swiss cantons. In the Dutch context too, Anabaptist thinking, shaped by anti-clericalism and rejection of church rituals and sacraments, permeated the Low Countries as of 1530. The Dutch Anabaptists, later Mennonites or Doopsgezinden, too rejected much of the liturgical tradition that had been passed down through the centuries within the Catholic Church. This was evidenced from early disruptive civic disobedience, like the example in the Martyr's Mirror of Simon de Kramer, so poignantly illustrated by Jan Lauken in the 1685 edition of this martyrology. We see Kramer refusing to bow down before the elements of the host during the clergy's procession through the city, an act of defiance that led to his arrest. Indeed, many Dutch Anabaptists placed little stock in outward actions and traditions, like fasting. All this to say, from the early days of Anabaptism, church traditions and many other aestheticized aspects of liturgy, including formal recognition of Lenten fasting in church life, were largely left by the wayside. Now let's fast forward several hundred years. It's 2021, and we as Mennonites are creating a Lenten movie reflection series. Many of us, as individuals or as congregations, do find ways to mark the Lenten season. In the last few weeks, I've been chatting with friends, ministers, and family about this reintegration of Lent among some Mennonite groups. This is, in fact, a relatively recent phenomenon, born primarily out of ecumenical influences from the later 20th century and onward. As many Mennonite communities have engaged with ecumenism intentionally or via influx of members from other denominations who have brought in traditions to share, we've been drawn back to the practice of Lent, to the potential value of an intentional, personal, and time-limited fasting period in the liturgical year. Throughout my life as a young person in the Canadian city of Winnipeg, I remember hearing about Lent, reflecting with family and friends about what we might give up for Lent, or indeed whether we might add in a spiritual discipline of some sort. Some folks would give up dessert, others meat, others TV. More recently, for many of my peers, the social media fast has become popular. Others add in a devotional book or some sort of other practice like that. Such fasting can, of course, become stripped of its devotional and personal relevance. There is the risk that it becomes secularized and functions only as a sort of second chance at New Year's resolutions. Indeed, many that I've talked to about this theme in the past few weeks have noted that they knew that Mennonites in the past didn't do Lent. This was not a part of the tradition historically. Others added, surely, if you practice a lifestyle or tradition that's worth doing, isn't it worth doing it all year long? My grandmother noted that they didn't speak of Lent in church when she was growing up. And my mum confirmed as well that while the Passion Story, Good Friday, and Easter were foundational within the church when she grew up, the 40-day Lenten discipline was indeed a later development, at least in the Winnipeg Mennonite experience. And from chatting with folks here in the Dutch context, that timeline appears to be very similar. While the reintegration of Lent is relatively recent, the Dutch and Canadian Mennonite friends that I talked to, especially those with a hunger for liturgy, poetry, and aesthetic elements in their lives, were appreciative of this ecumenically influenced space for reflection, quietude, and prayerfulness in the weeks leading up to Easter. It may be true that if certain practices are good for us, it is best to do them every day of the year, and yet, in our busy lives, such a period of intentionality can still be meaningful, whether we abstain from something, add something, or think intentionally about why we do not participate. I find this period demarcated for Lent can helpfully hold up a mirror to the patterns of my life in the rest of the year. As we make time for reflection, reading, quietude, are we aware of what we usually are filling up that time and space with otherwise? Extra emails, Zoom, Netflix, household chores, or absent-minded smartphone scrolling? It's interesting to keep tabs on this. I want to share a few snapshots of my experience of Lent among Mennonites here, and then, together with you, work through one of the Lenten practices that I have found meaningful in recent years. Ash Wednesday is the traditional Catholic marker of the beginning of Lenten fasting, the day that congregants receive the mark of the cross in ash upon their foreheads, a humbling, tactile, and visible reminder of our fragility and vulnerability. In some Mennonite churches and communities I've attended in Canada, we've organized and carried out the Ash Wednesday service for ourselves within our own Mennonite circles. Now that I'm a member of the Singelkerk in Amsterdam, I've really enjoyed the ecumenical teamwork embodied in their H4 initiative, the so-called Heilige Vierkant. This is the name of the 4 churches on and around the Spouw in Amsterdam because of their ecumenical gatherings and shared activities. And this includes the Doopsgezind Singelkerk, the Catholic Krijtberg, and the Lutheran Oude Kerk, as well as the English Reformed Church in the Begijnhof. Lent is one of the times when this ecumenical community is active together. While the Singelkerk does not do an Ash Wednesday service, the Krijtberg invites all to come and attend the Ash Wednesday service there. In past years, I have valued taking part in this service next to friends and acquaintances from all 4 congregations. A reminder that we can learn from each other and be shaped by the richness of each other's traditions. In my Canadian church congregation, we usually practiced communion together once a month. But in the Dutch context, I have come to appreciate the simple and beautiful practice of sharing the Lord's Supper only twice a year, and of these 2, one time on Witte Donderdag. a timing which is particularly useful for highlighting the context and relevance of the biblical story of the Last Supper in conjunction with the current day practice of it. Since moving to the Netherlands in 2015, I've also come to understand the Dutch love for the tradition of listening to, or indeed performing, Bach's Matthäus Passion on Good Friday, a tradition that is also valued by so many Mennonites that I have known here in Amsterdam. I notice, for instance, for these Menno Moments, the introduction music and closing music is in fact the opening chorus to this masterpiece by Bach. This year, we could not gather in person for an ecumenical Ash Wednesday. I don't know how we will do Witte Donderdag in a few days' time, and we will not be flocking to the concert halls on Good Friday. But we still have access to the stories and music, to the flexibility of personalized Lenten practice that is COVID-proof. For me, taking time for Lenten reflection, using artists' visual, musical, and poetic paraphrases of the Passion story has become a meaningful practice. I appreciate the way that artworks offer a glimpse into how different artists and their contemporaries have been affected and inspired by these stories over the centuries. Via the arts, I find space for connection and wonderment with these ancient narratives, and I find a chance to reflect upon the shared joys and struggles of the human condition. Since I'm an art historian, I can't resist ending with a painting. I want to look at an image with you. You could say, we'll do a painting analysis as Lenten practice. According to some museum researchers, the average museum visitor spends only about 15 to 30 seconds in front of any given artwork. Today I want to invite us to slow down, to look slowly. Look with me now at Rembrandt's painting of Peter's denial of Christ from Luke 22, verses 54 to 62. We will take some moments for silent looking, listen to the story, and then briefly explore how the painter has brought this narrative to life. Ze grepen hem vast en voerden hem weg en brachten hem naar het huis van de hoge priester. Petrus volgde hen op een afstand. Ze staken een vuur aan midden op de binnenplaats en gingen eromheen zitten. Petrus voegde zich bij hen. Een dienstmeisje zag hem bij het vuur zitten, keek hem strak aan en zei: Die man hoorde er ook bij. Maar hij ontkende het. Ik ken hem niet eens. Even later merkte een ander hem op en zei: Jij bent ook een van hen. Maar Petrus zei: Wel nee, man, helemaal niet. En ongeveer 1 uur later zei nog iemand met grote stelligheid: Jazeker, die man was ook in zijn gezelschap. Hij komt immers ook uit Galilea. Maar Petrus zei: Ik weet niet waar je het over hebt. En op datzelfde moment, terwijl hij nog sprak, kraaide er een haan. De Heer draaide zich om en keek Petrus aan, en toen herinnerde Petrus zich de woorden van de Heer. Nog voor er vannacht een haan heeft gekraaid, zul je mij 3 maal verloochenen. Hij ging naar buiten en huilde bitter. Imagine with me. In this painting, the servant girl has recognized Peter. She is in the act of speaking. She is perhaps midway through her exclamation, "This man was with him." Peter is hearing the girl's words, and we are seeing this crucial moment of contemplation play out before our eyes, just before he speaks. He hasn't yet made the denial that we already know he will make. The armor and sword of the man next to the servant girl, as well as the presence of a guard next to Christ, remind us, and Peter, of the very real possibility that he could be harmed or arrested. The tension of this personal moment is increased by a conflation of the verses from Luke 22, verses 54 to 62, into a single image. Two bystanders next to the servant girl offer a reminder of the additional accusations and denials that are still to come, 3 in total. And look to the top right corner. Christ already stares directly at Peter and us from his position in the darkened background. This is a moment of difficulty, of darkness, but it is not the end of the story. Thank you for joining me today.